Hello, and welcome to a guide to reading poetry. If you are watching this, then perhaps you are having some issues regarding poems, how to analyze them, how to interpret them, or even perhaps how to even read them. But if you are watching this and you don't have trouble, you must be a robot. Anyways, for those who are not robots, as a student who previously struggled with all of those things, I am here to help with these problems. In this video, we will look at a 19th century Victorian poem, Robert Browning's Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. In this video, we will aim at accomplishing 4 goals. The first goal is that we will begin by briefly identifying some basic and general poetic terminologies that are important to understanding the greater whole of the poem. While we settle down those terms, we will look at how the poem uses some of those terms previously defined as to give you an idea as to what those terms are meaning, an application of sorts. Next, we will introduce Robert Browning's poem by briefly discussing the dramatic monologue. This is an important background for many of Browning's poems. It will be good to have an understanding of what the dramatic monologue is, so that it is easier to interpret Childe Roland. Thirdly, we will then begin to dig into Robert Browning's poem, going stanza by stanza, paraphrasing each stanza, pointing out important literary devices, and discussing some literary analyses associated with the poem. The literary analyses that we will discuss will come from scholars such as Harold Bloom, Anne Williams, Arnold Shapiro, and Mike Tierce. Although there is an abundance of literary analyses available on this poem, this selection will just give us a basic understanding to what others are arguing about the poem. Finally, after interpreting the poem, pointing out literary devices, and analyzing the poem's contents, our last goal in this video will be discussing tips that you can follow in order to help you interpret future literary works that you will more than likely have trouble with. So now, let's begin with the foundation of understanding the poem and define some poetic terms. Perhaps one of the most basic and most important terms dealing with poetry is stanza. According to dictionary.com, a stanza is an arrangement of a certain number of lines forming a division of a poem. In other terms, a stanza is like a collection or group of lines in a poem. Another important poetic term is rhyme scheme, which is the ordered pattern of rhymes at the ends of the lines of a poem or verse. The last 2 terms important to poetry are metrical feet and metrical lines. A foot in poetry refers to syllables that together make up the smallest unit of rhythm in a poem. A metrical line refers to the number of feet consisting of one line. Now that we have a basic understanding of what these terms mean, let us now see how these terms are applied to poems, using Browning's poem as an example. If we take a look at Childe Roland as a whole, we can immediately see different groupings of lines within the poem. The individual groupings of lines would be defined as stanzas. So, with this, we can conclude that the first 6 lines of the poem are defined as one stanza. Now on to rhyme scheme. If we take a look at Childe Roland, we will see that the first line ends with word, the second line ends with I, the third lie, the fourth afford, the fifth scored, and the sixth thereby. We notice a pattern here where some words rhyme with certain others. So, following a rhyme scheme, this poem has a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, B, the A's all being rhyme words and the B's being different rhymed words. It's important to note here also that the next stanza would have the pattern C, D, D, C, C, D because those words do not rhyme with those in the first stanza, so they must get new letters. However, they still take the same rhyme scheme. The next term we will apply to the poem will be metrical foot. If we take a look at the first 2 words of the first stanza, we can see the light stress preceding the heavy stress, the red representing the light, the yellow representing the heavy. Thus, Childe Roland has a metrical foot of an iamb, which is defined as a word consisting of a light stress followed by a heavy stress. Lastly, we look at how metrical line is defined in the poem. If we take the first line of the first stanza, we can see the 5 sets of iambic feet, with the red representing the light stresses and the yellow representing the heavy stresses. Childe Roland would be counted as having a pentameter metrical line because the first line consists of 5, hence the prefix penta meaning 5, iambic metrical feet. If we then put the last 2 terms together, we can conclude that Browning's poem is an example of iambic pentameter. To aid with our interpretation of Childe Roland, I will be pointing out some important literary devices and techniques used throughout the poem. Just as a reminder, these are not the only devices and techniques used, nor are the examples I point out for each all there are. These are included just to give you an idea of what they are, where they occur, and how they affect the poem. Probably one of the most used devices is similes. There are plenty of similes found throughout the poem. Similes occur in the poem when the speaker compares two unlike things by using the words like or as. By providing us with similes, we the readers are able to get a better understanding on the seriousness or magnitude of a situation. We can look at what the object or person is being related to in order to get a better feel to how the speaker views it. Imagery is also very abundant in this poem, mostly because we are only provided with one speaker giving us descriptions of his surroundings from his perspective, hence the dramatic monologue. By using vivid words and descriptions, the examples of imagery I will point out will allow us to create a mental picture of what the speaker is describing. The use of imagery in poems is beneficial because it allows us to create a mental image of what is happening, as to put ourselves into the poem. A caesura is a fracture within a sentence where the two separate parts are distinguishable from one another, yet intrinsically linked to one another. These usually are thoughts separated in order to sit in the reader's mind to emphasize the mood at that current situation and moment. A pathetic fallacy is also present throughout Childe Roland. It can be seen similar to personification, but a pathetic fallacy bestows human characteristics upon inanimate nature. A metonymy involves referring to an object by using another word representative of it. In general, metonymies are used for the purpose of being more concise and giving more profound meanings to common ideas and objects. Finally, alliteration is present throughout the poem. Alliteration is defined as the repetition of the first stressed sound of a word. As we look at the examples of alliteration throughout the poem, we will notice that each example has at least two words in a line that have the same first stressed sound. Although the use of alliteration does not affect the theme, nor the content of the poem, it does provide a new form of rhythm throughout the poem. Throughout this video, I have provided a key color-coding each of these literary devices and techniques so that as we break each stanza down, any of these present in each stanza will be colored the same as in the key. This is here as a reference for your easy understanding and will remain here in the bottom right corner as we interpret the poem. Now that we have introduced and defined some literary devices that are present throughout the poem, let us now focus on Browning's Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came, both paraphrasing and interpreting it, and analyzing its components as a way to get a better understanding of the poem's meaning. Before we begin interpreting the poem, it is important to know a little bit about Browning's poetic visions. Robert Browning is most known for his use of the dramatic monologue in many of his poems and literary works. A dramatic monologue is defined as a poetic form like a play, in which a single character reveals himself or herself in the dramatic situation, addressed to a second person, usually the reader. In many cases, Browning's dramatic monologues do not reveal the truth at all times, nor do they reveal exactly what is happening in the story, as to get the reader to figure out for themselves what some deeper meaning is to the poem. Childe Roland is identified as a dramatic monologue because it consists solely of one character speaking, providing the reader with situations, scenery, animals, and other characters only through the speaker's thoughts and descriptions. This also provides the reader with an insight to the character's personality, another aspect of dramatic monologues. Now that you know this understanding of Browning's poem, we can begin to interpret Childe Roland. I would like to point out that I will not be reading each stanza for time's sake, so if you feel that you need to read each stanza before we discuss its elements, feel free to pause the video, read through it, and then play the video back. Now on to the interpretation of Childe Roland. This is the first stanza. This first stanza is the beginning to the character's, which is Childe Roland's, quest into the countryside in search for a tower. Here, Roland meets an old cripple who Roland believes is lying to him. He criticizes the cripple's mouth, believing that the cripple's answer to his question on which way to travel is wrong, and that all of the cripple's words were for the worse. Anne Williams, a literary scholar, argues here in the first stanza that this is the beginning of Campbell's first of three stages of a hero's quest, titled Crossing the First Threshold. She continues this by stating that the first 7 stanzas describe Roland's entrance into the land of the unknown, where adventure and discovery are possible. Williams also points out that the cripple acts as a threshold guardian in the story, as compared to Campbell's heroic quest. Heading into stanza 2, Roland continues his hatred and criticism of the old cripple he has been introduced with, this time questioning what the cripple's purpose is and arguing that he tells lies to those who pass him to ask questions, writing an epitaph, which is a statement written in memory of someone dead, knowing he sent them in death's path. Roland also believes that the cripple produces a skull-like laugh. This is the beginning to the many insights on the character's personality and character, when we look at word choices like skull-like resembling death. In the 3rd stanza, Childe Roland debates whether to take the path the cripple has pointed out, even knowing that the dark tower he is seeking is at the end of it. This becomes ironic after Roland's constant criticism of the cripple's word in the first 2 stanzas, but he ends up following what he says in the end. After consenting to the path of the cripple, he feels neither pride nor hope and only wishes that he finishes the task, without care of its success or failure, life or death. Harold Bloom, another literary scholar, points out that, in the underlined section, that his acceptance of the cripple's words shows Roland never believed the cripple was deceiving him. This, therefore, makes us, the readers, suspicious of what he says he sees and what he says. Roland's continuous searching for years has led to his hope greatly declining. Roland hardly tried to disapprove of the move his heart has made, finding it to be irrelevant. At the point where Roland's hope began to dwindle, as shown in the underlined section, Mike Tierce uses this as a parallel to Olive Browning's previous poetic hopes being apparently produced only ghosts, at the same time he was writing this poem. The first line in this stanza is one example of alliteration. If we look at this line, we notice the repeating W sounds in "what with my whole world wide wondering. This repetition of the W sound sort of establishes a new rhyming pattern for this stanza, without affecting the poem's general rhyme scheme and general rhyme pattern. The next 2 stanzas are grouped together because they consist of similar content, making a comparison of Roland's thoughts and feelings to those of a sick man's. Here, Roland thinks of a sick man, comparing his thoughts and feelings to when a man near death experiences his friend's sorrows. While some of his friends discuss of the funeral, plans, etc., the dying man only cares for the love and wants them to stay so that he can embrace their love and comfort. After his comparison to the dying man, Roland then continues his thoughts on another subject. Here he is reminiscing the past failures of the attempts of the past knights who tried to get to the Dark Tower. After realizing the many failed attempts from those knights, Childe Roland begins to question his ability to make it to the Dark Tower himself. Anne Williams here argues that in Roland's clear statement of motive, his passivity in regard to the whole journey is curious. In other words, the thought that Roland's will to motivation to succeed is a very slim possibility to readers. These thoughts only last a small amount of time, since Roland begins to focus on his present situation. Roland now turns away from the cripple into the path that the cripple has previously pointed toward. Roland notices that the day sky is shooting an uninviting red look so that it could view Roland astray in the path, even when day was becoming night. This point of the poem is argued by Anne Williams to be the beginning of Campbell's second stage of a hero's quest, titled The Belly of the Whale, which is the part of the journey in which the hero is isolated and swallowed up by the unknown. We see this with the presence of the grim red leer in the sky aimed upon Roland as he goes toward the path. Speaking of the grim red leer, Harold Bloom makes a statement that this description of the sunset marks a transition to the poem's ordeal by landscape. More simply, this is the beginning of Roland's focus on the pain the landscape gives him. He also states that the astray described at the end of the stanza is Roland, who wanders beyond the limits or out of the right way. Continuing with the description of the sunset. Now the red sky has found Roland, looking over the safe road, but it soon disappears. Roland then debates whether to go on the same path, but realizes that there is nothing else to do but to do so. Anne Williams states that in this stanza, in the underlined section, Roland becomes immediately lost, and this isolation blends gradually into Campbell's third stage of a hero's quest, titled Road of Trials, where the hero suffers in the strange land he has come. Williams points out also that, compared to other heroes' quests, Roland's trials are psychological rather than being caused by dragons or a sorcerer. The line colored yellow in this stanza is another example of alliteration, since we notice a repetition of the P sound at the beginning of pledged, plain, and pace. From this point, Roland now continues on his path, noticing that the path consisted of low-quality plant life. Instead of flowers were weeds and shrubs with none to give awe and beauty. Furthermore, Roland also notices that the land consists of poor vegetation with a lack of movement in plants and life in general, coming to a conclusion that the view around him was a very disgusting and painful sight to look at. However, nature seemed to speak back to him, arguing that it wasn't its own fault for being so ugly. Roland continues to examine nature, wondering what destroyed the environment after noticing that everything was bruised as a way to deny any and all hope of a green environment. He describes this denial as a brute destroying the greenness in the plant life with that exact intent. He begins to examine the grass, stating that it does not grow much, comparing this lack of vitality to a head not able to grow hair because of a medical disease. This is an example of a simile, since the grass is being compared to hair and leprosy by using the word as. By doing this, we get an idea of how dead the grass is in the land, because we know how someone with a medical disease is not always able to maintain and grow hair. This comparison just gives us a better understanding on how Roland's surroundings have a lack of vitality. He looks down upon the mud and notices there are blades underneath viewed to have blood all over them. Soon after, he notices a horse near his path, describing it to be very dead-like, with its bony neck stretched out, and believing it to be from the devil. Roland again examines the horse, thinking it might be dead because of its very thin, stretched-out neck and its rusty mane, which both give the horse a very grotesque image. This provides us with a very clear image to how the horse looks, so it is counted as an example of imagery. It is good to have imagery here so we are able to get a feel to how Roland views life around him, as to get a deeper understanding of his character. Again, remember we do not know if Roland's descriptions are accurate, but we take them to be so since it is the only ones we do have. Roland states that he hates the brute, meaning the horse, and thinks it must be evil to deserve such conditions. All of the underlined words and statements in this stanza help make Mike Tierce's argument that the descriptions of the horse suggest Browning's lack of poetic vitality, making a connection between Roland's thoughts to Browning's poetic failures occurring at the same time the work was being created. In the next stanza, Roland shuts his eyes and asks for happier sights so he could focus on accomplishing his quest. Another example of a simile is present here in green, which compares Roland's thoughts and desires to those of a man desiring alcohol before he fights. A man drinking alcohol before fighting is not usually seen as a great thing, so this comparison gives us an insight as to how Roland's state of mind is much more crippled than before. Also in this stanza is an example of a caesura, shown in purple. Think first, fight afterwards, the soldier's art. The hyphen in this line is included as to make us pause for just a few seconds and then continue with the rest of the line, as to make us ponder on what idea is being stated here. Both Tierce and Williams have statements to make on the stanza, the first coming from Tierce at the beginning of the stanza. Here, he interprets this section as Roland attempting to comfort himself by refusing to see his own failure and by focusing on the achievements of other knights. Williams' interpretation of the same section is that set upon the road of trials, the third stage of Campbell's heroic journey, Roland desires aid against despair, but seeks it within memories. These memories fail, however, because they are tainted with disillusionment, which means to have a feeling of disappointment resulting from the discovery that something is not as good as one believed it to be, sourced by knowledge of his comrade's ultimate failure and disgrace. We will see this in the next two stanzas. These next two stanzas consist of Roland's attempt to separate himself from his surroundings by using his memories. At the start of his memories, he imagines Cuthbert's red face beneath his golden hair until he almost felt him take his arm and lead him to the tower, Cuthbert being a soldier he is imagining. His memories begin to take a turn for the worse, however. Unfortunately, the two knights or poets he calls to memory are apparently failures. This, therefore, does not give him the satisfaction that he desires, so he begins to avoid focusing on those memories. After coming back to reality from his memories, Roland believes better this present than a past like that. In other words, he says to himself that it's better to be where he is now than to be where the knights he imagined were at. He focuses on the path again, no sight nor sound present that he could see. He wonders if night would make a sound, and asks when something on the dreary land stopped his thoughts and changed them to something else. Anne Williams points out that for the first time since crossing the threshold, Roland fixes his attention entirely on the present and on the immediate reality. Soon after, Roland unexpectedly crosses paths with a little river, which consists of a tide which was neither pleasant nor similar to the surrounding darkness. The river bubbles by, and it seems to Roland to might have bathed the horse's hoof, since it consists of black swirling fluid and foam. The first two lines in the stanza are another example of a simile, this time the little river being compared as unexpected to Roland's attention as would a serpent or a large snake. Mike Tierce, with his previous interpretation that the horse resembled Browning's poetic vitality, points out that the river has a clear potential to cleanse, but remains an untapped potentiality as a result of the grotesque horse's contamination. The river is described here to be full of malice. Roland notices low, messy trees covering the river and drenched willow trees putting them in a hopeless cluster. Roland also makes a statement that the river has done them all wrong, but rides by without any care of doing so. This entire stanza is counted as an example of pathetic fallacy because inanimate nature is bestowed with human characteristics. We can see that here with the words kneeled and flung, describing the state of nature around the river. This allows us to have a better understanding of the environment being described by Roland, since characteristics that sometimes describe us are being used to describe Roland's surrounding nature. There is also another example of imagery in the stanza, as outlined in blue. C.C. Clarke points this statement out by arguing that the abrupt transition from the language of sentiment to bare, matter-of-fact statement convinces us that Roland is no longer merely reading his own feelings into a nature inanimately, he is reporting dispassionately. This next stanza describes Childe Roland crossing over the little river. As Roland crosses the river, he fears stepping on a dead man's skull sitting beneath the water. During his journey across the river, he searches for a spear, and as he was searching, he finds that hollows off of the hollow trees had fallen and were tangled in the dead man's hair. After finally discovering a spear in the river, he comes across a water rat and spears it, the rat shrieking in the process. The last two lines in the stanza count as another example of a simile, this time the rat shriek in the process of being speared by Roland being compared to a baby shriek. This simile perhaps hits harder with us, because many of us tend to be sympathetic with infants and when they cry or whine. This results in some readers perhaps feeling even worse for the rat's death than if it was just stated that Roland speared the rat. Roland, happy to reach the other side of the river, examines the ground and wonders what strugglers were there before and what war they partook in to pack in the damp soil to a puddle. He compares the look of this war to toads in a poisoned tank or to wild cats in a hot cage, as to emphasize the deadly and wild characteristics the surrounding land had. Stanza 23 acts as a caesura to stanza 22, being a continued thought on the messed up surrounding land that Roland is examining. This caesura is in the split between two stanzas provides us with a longer thought of Roland's thoughts and feelings. It's a way for Childe Roland to emphasize and prolong his extreme thoughts onto his audience. Roland believes that the fight that took place before his arrival there must have seemed as the toads and wild cats. He wonders what stopped the strugglers there with all other land to go to, after seeing that no footprints were present after that point. Finding no other evidence of struggle, he believed that madness set in to affect their brains. Continuing on his path, Childe Roland sees an engine or frame and wonders if its use was to reel or wound men's bodies out like silk. He then comes across some dug-up ground, being once a wood, then a marsh, and now a naked earth. Throughout an area of the naked earth he was around, bay, clog, which is thick wet matter, and rubble consisted of the land. Another example of alliteration is present in the bottom stanza, desperate and done with. There is a double D sound present in this line that allows for a slight change in the rhyme pattern. Roland now comes across an irregular patch of land, colored gay and grim, defined as uninviting, and then some patches. On this path he also passes a paralyzed oak tree. Both Harold Bloom and Mike Tierce incorporate their own interpretations in the stanza. Harold Bloom points out that in the stanza, Roland's landscape is a continuous metonymy, in which a single negative aspect of everything substitutes for the thing itself. In other words, the landscape being described in this stanza is being defined by the negative characteristics of each object. Note here that the whole stanza is counted as a metonymy, even though half of it is colored differently. The first half is also used as an example of imagery, providing us with a vivid and detailed description of Roland's surroundings, but more specifically the patches around him. Mike Tierce argues that the disease imagery in this stanza suggests Browning's negative opinion of his own poetic abilities. This is similar to Tierce's previous argument that the horse's grotesque description matches up with Browning's declining poetic vitality. Here, Roland continues on his journey, stating that he sees nothing in the distance but evening, and there's nothing to lead him further along. Suddenly, as he began to give up his quest, a bird comes along. Its wing brushes Roland's hat as it sails past, and Roland then strikes a thought that this could be the guidance that he desired to make progress. And just as he thought that and looked up, mountains suddenly came into the picture, surrounding him. The only view he has now are heights and piles of rock and mountain, which surprised him. However, he told himself that he did not know how to get to those mountains he sought. A minority viewed this birth of the mountains and new terrain as a parallel to the birth of Roland's new outlook on nature and his quest in the same moment. This new Roland is seen as having a new openness and acceptance to the landscape. Once becoming distressed by not knowing what to do, Roland tries to recognize a trick of mischief that has happened to him before during a bad time in order to aid him in this predicament. His progress soon ends this way after failing to come up with something, and he begins to give up. Something clicks, however. The last line in the stanza counts as a caesura by emphasizing the click that Roland has in the midst of giving up his quest. Here, this click is compared to a trap shutting, and then you're inside the den. The hyphen located between as when the trap shuts and you're inside the den puts ourselves into a scenario when we instantly are locked away into isolation, which is a den, as to emphasize the suddenness or intensity of the click that occurred within Roland. An interpretation of the underlined portion of the stanza comes from Harold Bloom. It states that in the crucial moment of giving up, Roland is suddenly startled into a climatic recognition that he is trapped. Arnold Shapiro, another literary scholar who interpreted this poem, argues that the speaker, which is Roland, is no more mature than when he began the journey. He is cynical about what is happening to him. In other terms, Roland still has a distrust of human nature and has no concern for treating others fairly. This is the moment when Roland realizes that he is actually where he was trying to get to, after a life spent training for the site and moment he was in. In the midst of everything, Roland discovers the Dark Tower. He describes the tower as a broad and short structure being built of brown stone with nothing else connected to it. According to Harold Bloom, here Roland confronts at once a stage scene, a court of judgment, his failed precursors in the band, and an initiation all in the same moment. Arnold Shapiro argues here also that Roland still projects cruelty onto nature as he did before discovering the Dark Tower. Tierce, Williams, and Bloom all view the tower to resemble different things in the poem. Tierce believes that the tower is representative of a completed work of art, after discussing Browning's past poetic failures and his journey through Roland to finally find a successful piece of art. Williams views the tower to be representative of death itself, after viewing Roland's journey to be a journey towards death. Finally, Bloom points out his opinion that the tower is representative of the self-negating element in the activity of art. The next two stanzas consist of Roland talking to the audience, becoming more aware of his surroundings. Immediately after discovering the tower, Roland's surroundings become less bizarre. Soon day comes back, with the dying sunset glowing only through a split in the environment. The hills surrounding him lay around him to see him in the area. Noises begin to increase, with sound increasing like a bell and noises of lost adventurers ringing in his ear. He begins to admire the past adventurers' strengths, boldness, and fortune, but concludes that they were yet all lost. At this final moment of Childe Roland's quest, he views all of the past adventurers standing alongside the hillsides, watching him for the very last time. Roland states here that he recognizes them all. Finally, he blows into the horn with fearlessness and determination the song Childe Roland. Harold Bloom points out to the reader that this song is derived from Edgar's song in the story Lear. Finally, to conclude the literary analysis of the poem, Harold Bloom and Mike Tierce point out that this last scene is Roland's last act of dauntless courage, which is to accept his place in the company of the ruined. By doing so, Roland has triumphed by failing precisely as his predecessors failed, and by recognizing and so knowing that their failure was also a triumph. Now that we have broken down Robert Browning's poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, interpreted each stanza, and pointed out different literary devices and techniques used throughout the poem, I hope it will be a good benefit to you when trying to understand poems in future readings. My final tips for you, besides those mentioned before, are to read through the poem once. If nothing is taken from the first reading, break it down, stanza by stanza as we did here. Paraphrase each stanza. That also means look up words you don't know to help you. Look for literary devices throughout the poem to help you with your understanding. Once you do this, go get information and some input from the experts. Getting some input and information from literary scholars and critics will allow you to get a broader idea of the poem. It will also allow you to get a feel to what others are arguing about in regards to the literary work that you are studying. After that is accomplished, read through the poem once more. Hopefully it becomes much easier to understand after the second read-through. And finally, just know understanding poetry takes time. For those of you interested in learning anything about who is teaching you at the moment, you can pause the video and read through this. If not, just keep on listening. So, my fellow struggling poetry student, I encourage you now to go do as we have done here and aim for the success of understanding that difficult poem you have been faced with. May the odds be ever in your favor, and thanks for watching.